all the president's lies. While we're covering this war against truth, this ongoing crisis of credibility, journalists are feeling pressure from both sides. The question lots of Trump supporters ask is, why do you all hate the president? At the same time, the question Trump critics ask is, why do you all go so easy on him? Why aren't you all tougher? When he lies, why don't you say he lies? So let's talk about that. President Trump is the leader of the United States. He is also a liar. This has been well documented. Lying was a big part of his business strategy. He called it truthful hyperbole. Well, now, as commander-in-chief, he misleads the public constantly. I understand why many of you want news outlets to use the L word, lie, more often. You want us to affirm what we all see, that Trump has a truth problem. You want us to take it seriously, to take it really seriously, to recognize that it's damaging the country. And you want us to rethink how we do our jobs as a result. Maybe we shouldn't be reading his tweets aloud, because it's hard to believe anything he says. I agree, but let me attempt to also add some nuance. He lies, but not everything he says is a lie, and we need to distinguish between a deflection, an exaggeration, and a straight-up lie. Take Friday's tweet, claiming that murders in Chicago are happening at a record pace. Thankfully, they're not. Thankfully, homicides are down 22%. The number is still very high, but the number's on the way down. So either Trump has the wrong information, which makes this a falsehood, or he's lying. Look, it's bad either way, but we need to recognize the differences. I think this next example is more clear, though. Trump said on Saturday, "Why didn't the crooked highest levels of the FBI or justice contact me to tell me about the phony Russia problem?" Now, I think it's fair to call that one a lie, because according to NBC News, the FBI did brief him back in the summer of 2016, briefed him about Russia. So that would make this tweet intentionally false. In other words, a lie. But others might reach different conclusions. That's why we created this lie-o-meter on the bottom of the screen. It's worth thinking about the shades here. For example, when Trump blamed Democrats for separating immigrant children from their families, was that a deflection? Was he just shifting blame? Was it worse? Was it a distortion? Or was it a straight-up lie? Here's another one. Was Spygate an exaggeration or a falsehood? After all, Trump used lots of caveats this week to hedge his claims. Did you notice that? In this tweet, he said, "This could be one of the biggest political scandals in history, Spygate." So he said could be. He was hedging. He was hedging all week long. But the idea of a spy improperly infiltrating the campaign, it embedded itself everywhere. It was debunked, as you can see here, but it still dominated the news for days.
We now call it Spygate.
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 Don't use that word, because that's not what it is.
It's not right.
Are journalists doing enough to shut down these kinds of distortions? Are we doing enough to call out the lying? Joining me now, Sarah Westwood, CNN White House reporter, Daniel Dale, the Washington bureau chief of the Toronto Star, and Joan Walsh, a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and a CNN commentator. Joan, what should we be doing in situations like this? The word spy has been in the press all week long. I think the president succeeded in poisoning the discourse with this word.
He absolutely
Was this
did.
a media failure?
I think it was a media failure. I think we are behind the eight ball for a lot of reasons that are not our doing. Our job generally, Brian, is to quote the president. We go to his own words. That's why we go to his tweets. They are news. He calls it Spygate. We repeat it. I think we repeat it once. I think the constant, the way that it kind of became our default, I saw it on a lot of Chirons. I saw it leading into segments, even if it got debunked later. It was still, that word was still being used, and it gets out there. And for his supporters, it forms the basis of what they believe. And then when we try to debunk it, we're being unfair. So, I think we went with it way too long this week.
Daniel Dale, how do you handle this? You fact check every word Trump says for the Toronto Star. I think it's remarkable. How do you handle these quote unquote big lies?
I think we have to call them lies. We have to challenge them each and every time that Trump utters them. and we cannot get worn down by his persistence in saying things that aren't true. My issue with the media handling of his lying is not so much the big lies as the daily little lies. This is a central feature of his presidency, the incessant dishonesty. And I think it's still too often treated as kind of a sideshow rather than the show, rather than a central story. It's relegated to people like me or the great Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post or PolitiFact, rather than treated as a central part of the daily news coverage. And that's where I think it belongs.
I interviewed Glenn Kessler of the Post for our podcast this week. He made the point that he believes Trump's dishonesty is getting worse over time, meaning this time last year versus now, there are more falsehoods being shared on a daily basis. Let's talk about one of those in particular, Sarah Westwood. You've been covering this tweet from the president on Saturday, railing against the New York Times. He tweeted saying a, quote, senior White House official does not exist, even though dozens of journalists were at a briefing with this senior White House official. Tell us how this is an unusually black and white example of a Trump falsehood.
Right. We've seen President Trump go after the use of anonymous sources before, but this is an instance in which CNN and many other reporters were present for a background briefing with this official that was sanctioned by the White House. It was scheduled in advance. It was conducted just feet away from the Oval Office in the press briefing room, and yet President Trump attacked a quote from one of his own officials who was tapped to speak on behalf of the White House. His going after anonymous sources, though, is one of the most corrosive ways that he does attack the media. Anonymity,
by saying
obviously,
we make them up. Yeah.
Right, because he knows that in order to trust the news that an anonymous source is saying, you have to trust the reporter, that the reporter has assumed responsibility for the information presented. Once a source is anonymous, President Trump recognizes that. He exploits the people's unfamiliarity with the news gathering process to try to undermine the credibility of all of the press.
And Leslie Stahl gave up this game the other day, right? In this remarkable conversation at the Deadline Club, she said this is Trump's plan all along. She revealed a conversation she said she had with him more than a year ago, and here's what he revealed.
He said, you know why I do it? I do it to discredit you all and demean you all, so when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you.
So, assuming Leslie Stahl is telling the truth there, and there's no reason not to believe her, she has a lot of credibility, that confirms what a lot of us have believed for a long time. I wonder if we can take that to the next step then and say, what do we do about it? Daniel, what do we do about it?
Well, I think we challenge it every time. We challenge it professionally without...
And not get tired of it, not get used to it.
Not get used to it. And going back to my previous point, my issue with the media's handling has been that, he'll have a rally in which he'll say literally 25 false things. And the coverage of the rally will not even mention that. Reporters will often call out the lies or false claims or whatever you're going to call them on Twitter. But then if you read the coverage the next day or watch the nightly news segment, it's, Trump talked tax policy, Trump attacked such and such. I think that his lying, his dishonesty needs to be front and center in all of the coverage where appropriate. And I think it's
But do you
agree
with me that not everything is a lie, that some of what he says, he's just exaggerating?
I do. I'm less caught up on the word than a lot of liberals on Twitter are, and when they yell at me for not using the word lie. I think what's important as journalists, especially if we're going to hold ourselves out as arbiters of truth, we have to stick to what we know is true. So in some cases, we know that this president is confused about policy. We don't know that his intent is deliberately to deceive. In other cases, I think it is appropriate to use lie. When he says the head of the Boy Scouts called him to say you gave the best speech ever to the Boy Scouts, we know there was no such phone call. That there's no word for that other than lie. So I think we need to handle it on a case-by-case basis. What's important, though, is to point out when he's not telling the truth.
Joan, is some of the one of the factors here that journalists are trying to protect their access, you think, and that's why sometimes they go in easy on these claims?
I think that that's definitely a concern of folks on social media. I think that is, right or wrong, a lot of people think that is why we shy away from using the word lie, that we are not saying what is in plain sight.
I think it has more to do with us not knowing what he believes, not knowing what's in his head.
I think often that's true, but I honestly think that there are some journalists and some news organizations that really do go too far in trying to avoid the word lie. The word lie, it's very harsh, but it's very powerful, and it's very real. When it's real, it's there. I also want to ask, I don't know why some of our news organizations, Brian, didn't just out the name of that senior White House official who gave the briefing that the president denied existed. Maybe he or she would get in trouble with the president.
Well, I was
maybe
in those conversations last night. I think part of the answer is it wasn't this guy's fault, right?
Right.
This was an anonymous aide. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't renege. He didn't lie to the press.
But he works for an administration that is now calling us liars. He or she works for an administration is now participating in this lie about our news business. Why are we not more protective of our own news business and our own credentials and our own integrity than this poor guy? This poor guy can go get another job.
All
He
right.
can apologize to the president. He can call us liars, but I don't see why we're protecting him.
Hey, let's see if he stays in his job or not. Well, one more point about the L word, Sarah Westwood. Here's how MSNBC's Nicole Wallace, a former Bush administration official, handled one of the president's tweets the other day.
Can anyone even imagine having spies placed in a competing campaign by the people and party in absolute power for this? So I'm not reading any more of this. You know what? Bret Stephens, this is, and even by reading it, these are bold-faced lies.
All right, Sarah, I'm putting you on the spot here as a CNN White House reporter. How do you handle these situations when we are, both of us, covering tweets on the air that are full of holes?
Well, look, that's a remarkable response from Nicole Wallace because it's not one that you see often. President Trump exploits our journalistic impulses, knowing that we're going to have to discuss the context around any one of his claims. And by saying something that's blatantly untrue, he knows we're not going to be able to help ourselves. We're going to have to fact check it. And so we are constantly discussing the FBI's use of a confidential source, even though it didn't deviate from standard operating procedures. We are talking about MS-13 when he makes unrealistic claims about their effects on, society and stuff like that. We are being led to cover the things he wants us to cover in the form of fact-checking, but we're still talking about it.
Right, he's using his bully pulpit very effectively. MS-13 is a threat. I don't think it's the kind of threat that he exaggerates it to be. I also don't think that's a lie. I think it's somewhere on that spectrum, and it's very complicated.